The Alpha King's twins rejected every nurse in the palace, until the servant girl everyone mocked walked in. The twins had not stopped crying for 3 days. Not for the silk-clad nursemaids the palace had hired at great expense. Not for the royal healers who burned lavender oil and chanted soft remedies through the night. Not for Queen Jane, who stood at the nursery door exactly once long enough to straighten her gown and leave. And not for Alpha King David himself, whose voice had once made battle-hardened soldiers drop their swords without question. Donald and William, the crown princes of Ashford Palace, screamed as though the world had already failed them. And maybe it had. By the third morning, the palace corridors smelled like exhaustion. Nursemaid Kristen had not slept. Her neat uniform was wrinkled now at the collar, her eyes rimmed red. She had tried everything. Warm milk, swaddling, humming, rocking, walking in circles until her ankles ached. The twins took one look at her face each time she leaned over their shared crib and screamed louder, as though she were the very source of their distress. One by one, the other nursemaids had been dismissed or had walked away themselves. Some left quietly, others left in tears. A few left angry, muttering things under their breath that would have gotten them thrown in the palace dungeon if the guards had heard clearly enough. Outside the nursery door, the servants whispered the way servants always do when things go wrong in high places in low voices, with wide eyes and fast tongues. "They're cursed," said one laundry maid, clutching her basket like it might protect her. "No child rejects comfort like that unless something is deeply wrong with the palace itself," said another. "It's a sign," whispered a third, glancing toward the ceiling as if the answer were written on the stone. "When even a king cannot soothe his own blood." The conversation died the moment King David stepped into the hallway. He was tall, the kind of tall that fills a doorway without trying. His dark wavy hair was pushed back from his face, and there were shadows under his eyes that had not been there 2 weeks ago. He wore his black coat lined with charcoal fur, not because there was a ceremony today, but because he had never made it to bed the night before. He had been awake, listening, pacing, trying to understand what his sons needed that he could not give them. The servants scattered like startled birds. King David stood at the nursery threshold for a long moment. Through the open door, the sound of his sons crying reached him, thin, sharp, relentless, and something behind his eyes tightened. He was a man who had led armies. He had negotiated treaties that reshaped the borders of 3 kingdoms. He had done things in war that still visited him in sleep. But these 2 small boys who needed something he could not identify were breaking him in ways no battlefield had managed. "Kristen," he said. She appeared at once, hands clasped, face pale. "Your Majesty, I've tried everything on the list." I know," he said, not unkindly. "Is there anyone left we haven't tried?" Kristen hesitated. Her mouth opened, then closed. "Kristen, there is one person." She said it like it embarrassed her. "But, Your Majesty, she is a kitchen girl. She has no training. She has no—" "Bring her," he said, and from the far end of the corridor, before Kristen could even move to fetch her, a quiet voice spoke. "I can try." Heads turned. Laughter followed. Deborah stood at the edge of the hallway, still holding a damp cloth she had been using to wipe down the baseboards because that was her life, polishing the parts of the palace nobody looked at. Her blonde hair was loosely tied, a few strands escaping at her temples. Her dress was plain, worn at the elbows, clean but clearly mended more than once. Her eyes were tired in the way that comes not from one bad night but from years of them. But those same eyes, gray and steady and completely unafraid, did not match the laughter around her. She looked directly at King David. He looked back. The laughter faded. "Hey, quick question. How are you feeling right now? Because if this moment already has something pulling at you, if you are wondering what it is about a mocked kitchen girl that makes a king go silent, then you are exactly where this story wants you. Thank you so much for being here. Truly means the world to me. It is essential that we get your support through subscriptions, likes, and comments. So if this story is already pulling at your heart, please hit that subscribe button for us, smash the like, and drop a comment telling us where you are watching from. It helps more than you know. Alright, thank you. Now let's get back to the story. Deborah had been at Ashford Palace since she was 11 years old. She had not arrived with much. A small cloth bag, a name nobody bothered to learn for the first 2 years, and a quiet that people mistook for stupidity, when it was really something else entirely, something closer to patience, though she herself could not have named it at the time. The palace kitchens ran on a system that was more military than culinary. At the top sat Brenda, head kitchen authority, though no official title captured the full extent of her power. Brenda was broad-shouldered, sharp-eyed, and spoke at a volume that suggested she had once been the loudest person in every room she had ever entered and had decided to simply stay that way. Her apron was always pressed. Her hair is always pinned. Her standards were the kind that made grown men flinch. She had taken one look at 11-year-old Deborah standing in the kitchen doorway and said, without ceremony, "Can you work?" "Yes, ma'am." "Can you be quiet when I need you to be quiet?" "Yes, ma'am." "Good. Everything else you'll learn or you'll leave." Deborah had stayed. 7 years later, she knew the kitchen the way she knew her own heartbeat. She knew which floorboards creaked at 3 in the morning when the bread ovens were loaded. She knew that Brenda's anger ran hot and fast and rarely lasted more than 20 minutes. She knew that the girls who had worked there longer than she had found their daily entertainment in making her life quietly miserable, not because she had done anything wrong, but because she was different in a way they couldn't quite name and so chose to mock instead of understand. Her dress was always the plainest. Her meals were eaten last, whatever was left. When she laughed, which she did, though rarely around others, it was the kind of laugh that surprised people, warm and sudden, gone before they could decide what to make of it. She did not fight back. Not because she was weak, because she had learned something that takes most people far longer to understand. That responding to cruelty with cruelty only multiplies it. She had seen what happened to people who let bitterness make their decisions. She had watched it hollow them out, one argument at a time, until there was nothing left but the argument itself. So she scrubbed, she polished, she carried and swept and folded and was invisible in the way that only the truly overlooked can be, not because she lacked presence, but because the people around her had decided, long ago, that she was not worth noticing. That morning, the morning of the 3rd day of crying, she had been on her knees in the east corridor, working along the baseboards with a cloth that smelled of lemon and vinegar, when she heard it. The sound had been there for days, woven into the walls of the palace like a second heartbeat. The crying of the princes. Most of the other servants had learned to tune it out. Deborah had not. There was something about the sound that reached into her chest and stayed there. Not pity, though she felt that too. Something older. Something she couldn't explain and did not try to. When she heard Kristen mention that there was no one left to try, she had not planned to speak. The words came out before her mind gave permission. "I can try." And the hallway laughed. She stood in the laughter without flinching. That was perhaps the most startling thing about it. She did not look down, did not step back, did not apologize for existing in that moment. She looked at the king, and the king looked at her, and whatever passed between them in those few seconds was not nothing. "What is your name?" King David asked. "Deborah, your majesty. And you work in the kitchens?" "Yes, your majesty." He studied her for a moment. She did not move. "Come then," he said. The laughter in the hallway stopped so completely it left a ringing silence. The nursery smelled like lavender and sleeplessness. Deborah stepped through the doorway and felt the sound hit her 2 small voices in full fury, filling the room from corner to corner. The crib sat beneath the window where the gray morning light came in soft and cold. Donald lay on his back, fists clenched, face red. William had rolled to his side, his tiny body rigid with the effort of his distress. Kristen stood to the side, hands folded, expression carefully neutral in a way that did not entirely conceal her relief at no longer being the person in the room responsible for fixing this. King David stood near the door, watching. Deborah walked to the crib. She did not rush. She did not reach for them immediately. She stood at the edge of the crib for a moment and simply looked at them the way you look at something you recognize, though you could not say from where. Then she leaned down slowly, and she picked up Donald first, settling him against her shoulder the way her hands seemed to know how without being taught. The crying did not stop instantly. But it changed. The sharp, frantic edge went first, the sound of panic softening into something more like confusion, then inquiry, then a quieting sound that spread through the small body in her arms like warmth spreading through cold hands. Donald turned his face toward her neck. His fists slowly unclenched. His breathing ragged and stuttered just moments before began to slow. Then silence. Kristen made a small sound. Not quite a gasp. Something between disbelief and recognition. Deborah reached for William without setting Donald down. She shifted smoothly, instinctively, and gathered the second boy against her other side. William went quieter still, pressing against her like he was finding something he had been missing. The nursery was completely silent. After 72 hours, the silence was almost loud. King David had not moved from the doorway. He stood very still, the way powerful men go still when something happens that their experience has not prepared them for. He was watching Deborah's face, not the boy's. Not Kristen, just Deborah's face, where something had settled that he could not name. She was not performing calmly. She was simply calm. There was a difference, and he could see it, though he could not have explained exactly what it was. It was the difference between someone who is at peace because nothing is wrong, and someone who has learned to be at peace regardless. Deborah looked up and found him watching her. She did not look away. "They needed to feel safe," she said quietly. She was not offering an explanation for his benefit. She was just telling the truth. "How did you know?" King David asked. "I didn't know," she said. "I just knew I wasn't afraid of them." The king said nothing, but something shifted in his expression, something he was not ready to examine, and so did not, and instead turned and walked down the hall. Kristen waited until he was gone. "Don't let this go to your head," she said. Deborah looked at her mildly. "I'll need a chair," she said, "and something warm to drink. I imagine I'll be here a while." Kristen stared at her. Then, with a slight lift of her chin that might have been respectful or might have been offensive. It was genuinely difficult to tell, she turned and went to find a chair. Deborah settled into the rocking motion that had come so naturally, both boys heavy and warm against her. Through the nursery window, the gray morning was beginning to lighten. Outside, the palace was stirring. The day was starting. And in the furthest, quietest corner of her mind, something Deborah had carried for a long time, a cold, heavy weight she had grown so used to that she had stopped noticing its shape shifted, just slightly, in a direction she could not yet see. Word traveled the way it always does in places where people are bored and proximity is unavoidable. By evening, every person in Ashford Palace had heard some version of what had happened in the nursery that morning. The kitchen staff got a version that emphasized how ridiculous it was that a floor-scrubbing girl had succeeded where trained nursemaids had failed. The ladies-in-waiting got a version that was more romantic in structure, something about quiet courage and a mysterious connection. The guards told each other a straight version because guards generally prefer those. Queen Jane got the accurate version, delivered by her personal attendant with appropriate neutrality of tone and a slightly too careful expression. Jane received it sitting at her dressing table, looking at herself in the mirror with the focused precision of someone who considered their reflection a project to be managed rather than simply observed. She was beautiful in the way that cold things are beautiful, sharp and flawless, and not particularly interested in whether you were comfortable looking at it. She said nothing for a long moment after the attendant finished speaking. "A kitchen girl," she said finally. Not a question. More of a repetition that allowed her to taste how absurd the words were. "Yes, Your Majesty. Her name is Deborah. She works under Brenda in the—" "I didn't ask for her name." Jane set down the small brush she had been using. "I'll visit the nursery this evening." The attendant knew better than to say anything. Queen Jane visited the nursery at precisely 7 in the evening, when the light in the palace had gone amber and the air smelled of the evening kitchen. She arrived without announcement, which was itself a kind of announcement. Deborah was sitting in the chair, both boys asleep against her. She looked up when the Queen entered and immediately moved to rise. "Don't disturb them," Jane said. She did not say it out of consideration for the babies. She said it so that Deborah would remain seated while she stood, which was its own kind of positioning. Jane walked slowly around the crib, examining it with an expression that suggested she found everything technically acceptable and nothing emotionally significant. She did not reach for the twins. She did not lean over them the way people generally do with sleeping infants, that involuntary softening, that pull. She looked at them the way one might look at a ledger that balanced correctly. Then she looked at Deborah. Deborah held the queen's gaze without aggression or submission, just a steady, quiet presence that Jane had clearly not expected. "How long have you worked in this palace?" Jane asked. 7 years, Your Majesty. "And before that?" "I was brought here at 11. "Brought? By whom?" A pause. Brief but distinct. "I don't know, Your Majesty. I was a child." Jane smiled. It was the kind of smile that didn't reach anywhere. "Of course you were," she said. "You'll find, Deborah, that people in palaces have long memories. Everything that happens here is remembered. Do try to keep that in mind." She left before Deborah could respond. In the corridor outside, Jane moved at her usual composed pace. But her mind was working fast, cataloging, connecting, calculating in the way that had served her very well for a long time. There was something about that girl that Jane recognized, even if she could not yet say exactly what it was. And things Jane recognized but could not control were the only things that ever actually frightened her. Back in the kitchen the next morning, Brenda cornered Deborah before she could reach her usual station. "You're being reassigned," Brenda said, arms folded, expression carved from certainty. "I know," Deborah said. "Full-time nursery. Both boys. Day shifts with Kristen covering nights." "All right." Brenda looked at her for a moment longer than the conversation required. "Watch yourself up there," she said. Her voice dropped, not into softness exactly, but into something adjacent to it, a frequency Deborah had heard from her maybe 4 times in 7 years. "The nursery isn't the kitchen. People up there have a great deal more to lose." Deborah looked at her. "More to lose than what?" Brenda held her gaze for a beat too long. "Then they're willing to let anyone know about it," she said. Then she unfolded her arms, turned, and walked back toward the ovens. "Now go. You're wasting morning." Deborah watched her go. She had always suspected that Brenda knew more than she said. This was the closest the woman had come to confirming it. The days settled into a rhythm. Donald had a temper the size of him, which was not yet very large, but seemed to operate on a scale that ignored that limitation. When he was displeased with something and his threshold for displeasure was low and unpredictable, he communicated this with the full force of his lungs and both legs at once, which together produced an effect that was genuinely impressive for someone who weighed less than 15 pounds. In contrast, William was quieter, more watchful. He had a habit of staring at faces as though he were reading something there, particularly Deborah's. He would fix her with those dark, steady eyes and just look, with an expression of concentration that seemed, on a baby, faintly comic and faintly unnerving at the same time. Deborah learned them the way you learn people when you pay attention without an agenda, not cataloging, just absorbing. Donald needed to be moving, still air made him anxious. William needed sound, specifically the sound of a voice talking steadily, about anything. Silence at night unsettled him in a way that a song or a gentle one-sided conversation about nothing in particular would immediately resolve. So she talked to them. She told them about the kitchen, about the smell of bread at 4 in the morning, about how Brenda once shouted so loudly at a delivery man that a pot fell off its hook across the room, about the mouse she had seen twice in the east corridor, who moved with a confidence that suggested it had been there longer than the building. She told them about the garden she could see from the nursery window, about the first frost that was coming, about the way the palace looked different in different lights. She was not doing this for anyone listening. She was doing it because talking to them made them calm, and calm was something she understood how to maintain. King David started appearing in the doorway. Not during the difficult hours, not at 3 in the morning when the boys were fussing. During the quiet ones. Mid-morning, when the light came in sideways and both boys were fed and content. Deborah would be doing something ordinary, folding small blankets, adjusting the window, talking in her low, steady way to whoever was awake. He did not announce himself. He would simply be there when she turned around, leaning in the doorframe, arms folded, watching. The first few times, she straightened and addressed him formally, as was correct. The fourth time, he said, You don't need to stop what you're doing. So she didn't. He began to stay longer. Not doing anything, just occupying the chair near the window that nobody used, watching his sons with an expression that was hard to look at directly. It was the face of a man who loved something deeply and was afraid of the depth, who had found his footing in every other room of his life and could not find it here, in this small room with 2 sleeping boys, where his competence meant nothing and his softness was the only currency. One morning, William woke up fussing and Donald immediately started in sympathy, and before Deborah could get to them, David crossed the room and picked up Donald carefully. The way people handle things they are afraid of breaking, and settled him against his shoulder. Donald stopped crying. David went very still, as though the wrong movement would end it. His son's small hand had found his collar and gripped it. He stood like that for a long time, not looking at Deborah, though she was watching. "He's never let me hold him like this," he said quietly. "Came out without armor." "He knows you now," Deborah said. "They both do. Because of you," he said. "Not flattery. Observation." "No," she said. "Because you kept showing up." He looked at her then. She was not looking back at him. She was focused on William, who had settled now, making small, contented sounds. But he kept looking at her for a moment longer than he intended. And when he finally looked away, something in the room had changed in a way that neither of them was ready to name. There is something worth noting here, something true that has nothing to do with palaces or crowns. The people who show up consistently, without being asked, without recognition, without reward, they are the ones who build real trust. Not the ones with authority. Not the ones with titles. The ones who keep coming back. King David had been showing up to that nursery every morning for 10 days. Not as a king, as a father. And his sons had noticed before he did. There is a lesson in that for all of us. Queen Jane had a room that nobody in the palace was permitted to enter. This was not unusual for a queen's private chambers, personal correspondence, the ordinary architectures of privacy that power requires. But this room was different in ways that Kristen, who had been at Ashford Palace for 11 years and had eyes that missed very little, had slowly assembled into a picture she had not wanted to see clearly. The pieces had come one at a time, across months, the way things do when no single piece is dramatic enough to act on, but the accumulation becomes impossible to ignore. A midwife, the one who had been present at the birth of the princes, had left the palace 3 days after delivery. Quietly, without ceremony, offered a very generous sum that was explained as a retirement gift for loyal service. She had not been old enough to retire. The birth records in the palace registry listed the princes as born at a specific time, on a specific night. Kristen had happened to be on duty that night. The time on the records did not match what she remembered. And then there was the matter of the scent. This sounds small, and Kristen understood exactly how it sounded. But she had been a nursemaid long enough to understand that infants who reject every other caregiver and accept only one specific person are generally doing so on a biological basis. Scent, heartbeat, the recognition of something familiar in the way bodies carry memory before the mind can. Deborah was not the queen. And yet, Kristen sat with all of this for 3 days. She turned it over. She looked for an alternative arrangement of the facts that would let her put everything back in its acceptable place. She tried very hard to find one. She didn't. On the 4th day, she went to find Brenda. Brenda was in the cold storage room at the back of the kitchen. She went there when she needed to think, and had done for as long as anyone could remember, though she would never admit this was the reason. She looked at Kristen standing in the doorway and said nothing. "You know something," Kristen said. It was not an accusation. It was simply a statement of what she had decided was true. Brenda was quiet for a moment. "I know a great many things," she said. "Most of them aren't mine to tell." "These ones are," Kristen said. Brenda looked at her steadily. Then she looked at the floor. Then she reached up and touched the pin in her hair, a nervous habit she would have denied having, and said, very quietly, "She came to us because she had nowhere else to go. She was 11 years old. I was told to ask no questions and I didn't, because questions then had consequences I wasn't prepared to face. I've been asking them ever since." "What was her name?" Kristen said. "Before the palace." Brenda looked at her. "Her name was always Deborah," she said. But her family name was Ashford. The cold storage room was very quiet. Ashford, Kristen repeated. As in? Yes, Brenda said. Kristen stood with this for a moment. She's noble blood. She's more than that, Brenda said. But I need you to be very careful with what I'm about to say, because once it's said, I can't take it back. Kristen waited. Brenda told her. And Kristen, who had spent 11 years at Ashford Palace believing she understood how it worked, went back to the nursery and looked at Deborah holding those two boys, and felt the entire architecture of her understanding rearrange itself without her permission. The confrontation did not begin with a revelation. It began with a directive. Queen Jane had a habit small and methodical and quietly vicious of finding ways to remind people of their place. For Deborah, this took the form of a palace-wide directive that kitchen staff temporarily reassigned were not permitted to use the servant corridors of the upper floors during evening hours, effective immediately. It was worded generically, applied to no one specifically, and was designed to force Deborah to use the main corridor where the ladies-in-waiting would see her and have things to say. It worked in the sense that Deborah was seen, but not in the way Jane had intended. What the ladies-in-waiting saw that evening was Deborah carrying both princes through the corridor. She had not wanted to leave them before they settled, and the princes were asleep on her shoulders, silent and content. The image was so striking that the commentary it generated was not mockery at all. King David heard about it 3 hours later. He heard about the directive from Kristen, who had come to him that same evening with the face of someone who had been carrying something heavy for too long, and had decided the only option left was to set it down in front of someone who could do something about it. She told him everything she knew. She told him about the birth records, about the midwife who had left, about Brenda, about what Brenda had said carefully, completely without embellishment. She laid it out with the precision of someone who had rehearsed it multiple times and was determined not to lose her nerve midway through. The king did not interrupt her. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. There is a particular kind of silence that powerful people go to when they are processing something that challenges the foundation of everything they thought they knew. It is not the silence of doubt. It is the silence of rearrangement, of a mind working very fast through very complex material, trying to find the shape of a truth that has been buried under years of someone else's careful lying. David had married Jane under the belief that his prior betrothal to the daughter of the Ashford line had been dissolved due to betrayal. He had been shown a letter, formally written and signed, in which Deborah's family had withdrawn the arrangement in terms that were personal and damaging enough that he had never questioned them. He had spent years believing she had chosen to reject him. He sat in his study long after Kristen left, doing the one thing that had served him better than military strategy or political instinct. He sat with the discomfort of not knowing yet, and he did not rush to fill it. In the morning, he summoned the palace record-keeper. 3 hours later, he had in his hands a copy of the letter from the Ashford family. The letter that had ended his betrothal. The letter that had changed the course of 5 people's lives. The seal was real, but the handwriting did not match any sample on record from the Ashford household. It matched Jane's secretary's hand. David set the letter down on his desk very carefully. He was still for a moment. Then he stood, straightened his coat, and went to find Deborah. He found her in the nursery, where she usually was. It was late afternoon, and the light through the window had gone gold and low. Both boys were awake. Donald was on his stomach on the rug, discovering with considerable outrage that he could not yet move his arms and legs in the coordinated way he clearly felt they should be moving. William was watching this from Deborah's lap with an expression of scientific interest that on anyone else might have looked indifferent but on him seemed deeply invested. Deborah was laughing softly at something Donald had done. That warm, sudden laugh that went as fast as it came, and David stood in the doorway and watched her for a moment before she knew he was there. It struck him, standing there, how many times he had been in a doorway watching this woman in this room with his sons, and how many times he had looked and not understood what he was seeing. She looked up. "Your Majesty." He came into the room and closed the door behind him. "I need to tell you some things," he said, "and I need you to stay, even if the telling is hard." Something shifted in her face. Not fear. More like a person who has been standing in a wind for a long time, feeling it push against them, suddenly understanding which direction it came from. "All right," she said. He told her. He told her what he had found in the records, what the handwriting comparison showed, what Brenda had told Kristen, and what Kristen had brought to him. He told her about the betrothal letter, the one that had been signed with her family name and had not been written by her family. He laid it out carefully, without drama, the way you lay out something fragile, not because you want to protect it, but because you want the person receiving it to be able to hold it. Deborah listened. She did not cry. She was very still in the way she went when she was processing something difficult. Not shut down, not distant, just inward, working through it with the thoroughness she brought to everything. When he stopped talking, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she looked at the twins, at Donald, who had now resigned himself to immobility and was regarding the ceiling with majestic philosophical acceptance, and at William, who had leaned back against her hand in his sleep, and she said something very simple. "They knew before I did." David looked at her. "They knew who I was," she said, "before either of us understood it." She was not saying this with anger, though she had every right to be angry. She was saying it with the same quiet steadiness she brought to everything, the quality that had looked like passivity to people who didn't understand the difference between being quiet and being defeated. The truth does not always arrive on time. It does not arrive loudly. It does not come with a formal announcement or with anything that makes it easy to receive. It comes when it comes, and it asks you to decide in the moment of receiving it whether you are willing to let it change what you do next. Deborah was willing. King David was willing. Jane was not given the option of willingness. She was summoned to the throne room the following morning, and the evidence was presented in full, in the presence of the palace council and 2 external witnesses, and Brenda, who stood with her arms at her sides and her chin up and her expression that of someone who had been waiting a long time to be in this particular room for this particular reason. Jane did not break. That was not in her nature. She stood straight and elegant and composed and looked at David with those sharp, controlled eyes, and for a moment the room was completely silent. "Everything I did," she said with remarkable composure, "I did for this throne." "I know," King David said. He did not say it with bitterness. He said it sadly, which was worse. "And in doing it for the throne, you cost it the only things that actually hold it." Jane held his gaze for a long moment. Then she looked away. The terms were formal and firm. Banishment with provisions for safety and basic welfare, because David was not cruel, and because cruelty in consequences is its own corruption. The marriage was formally dissolved with a council vote that came quickly and without much deliberation. Jane left Ashford Palace in the same composed silence in which she had operated most of her life, right until the moment she stepped through the main gates, and something in her bearing, very slightly, fell. Nobody mentioned it. Brenda was honored at a formal council gathering. She stood in the chamber and explained, with her characteristic volume and directness, exactly what she had known, when she had known it, and what it had cost her to protect someone else's secret for 7 years when her natural preference was to be direct about absolutely everything. There was laughter in the chamber. Real laughter, the surprised kind that doesn't come from performance. Brenda accepted the honor with a nod so precisely it communicated both acknowledgement and the message that she did not require a great deal of ceremony about it. Afterward, in the kitchen corridor, she found Deborah waiting for her. "You knew," Deborah said. "I knew enough," Brenda said. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because some things have to arrive in their own time. If I'd told you when you were 12, it would have destroyed you. At 18, it would have made you reckless. At 22, she paused. At 22, you were ready to hold it." Deborah looked at her for a long time. "I'm still angry," she said. "Good," Brenda said. "You should be. And also grateful," Deborah said. "For what it's worth." Brenda turned back toward the kitchen with the air of someone concluding a conversation that had gone exactly as long as it needed to and not a moment longer. "Don't go soft on me now," she said. "I still have a kitchen to run." Deborah laughed, that warm, sudden laugh, and for a moment the corridor felt brighter than it had in a long time. The formal restoration came on a clear morning, 3 weeks later. Deborah stood in the great hall and received what had been taken from her, not a crown first, but a name. Her name, in full, restored to the palace records and spoken aloud by the council recorder in front of everyone assembled. Deborah Ashford. The name that had been buried under 7 years of worn dresses and cold corridors and someone else's careful, calculated erasure. Donald and William were present, held by Kristen, who had dressed them in the small formal clothes that made them look, simultaneously, more important and more hilarious. Donald was busy examining the button on Kristen's sleeve. William was looking at Deborah with that serious, focused expression of his, as though confirming something he had already decided was true. King David stood beside her. Before the council, before the assembled household, he said something that had not been on the formal agenda. "I spent years believing a story someone else wrote about you," he said, "and I am deeply sorry for every consequence of that belief. You deserved better from me before any of this. Whatever you choose now, stay, go, build something new is yours to choose. I only ask that you know the truth of what I think, which is that I have never admired anyone the way I admire you. Not for surviving what you survived, for remaining who you are through surviving it." Deborah looked at him. Behind her, very faintly, she heard Brenda make a sound that was probably dust-related. "I'll stay," Deborah said, and then, because she had spent too long being serious in important moments, she added, "Although I would like a room that does not share a wall with the laundry." There was laughter in the great hall, the kind that comes when tension has been too high for too long and something finally breaks it cleanly, and it turns out what was underneath was warmth all along. Donald, startled by the laughter, looked up and then, as though he had been waiting for permission, broke into a wide, gummy, completely undignified smile. William, not to be outdone, did the same, and the great hall of Ashford Palace, which had been holding its breath for a very long time, exhaled. This story is, at its core, about something simple: worth does not require permission. Deborah did not become valuable when the palace recognized her. She was valuable long before scrubbing floors in a worn dress, talking to 2 babies no one else could reach, carrying someone else's secrets with more grace than those secrets deserved. Her worth was not created by restoration. The restoration only made visible what had always been real. We live in a world that has a habit of measuring worth by visibility, by title, by recognition, by who knows your name. And that habit does tremendous harm not only to the people who are overlooked, but to the people doing the overlooking, because they go through their lives walking past people like Deborah every single day and missing what was right in front of them. The twins knew. Before words, before understanding, before anyone had said a thing they knew. That is not magic. That is the oldest truth there is. Love recognizes itself. And no amount of palace politics or forged letters or years of deliberate erasure can change what is fundamentally true about a person. So if you are somewhere today, doing the unseen work, carrying more than anyone around you understands, wondering if it matters, it does. It always did. Hey, quick question. How are you feeling right now? Did Deborah's journey touch something in you? Maybe something in her story reminded you that no matter how invisible the world has made you feel, your worth never disappeared. It was there the whole time. Thank you so much for being here with us today. Truly means everything. If this story made you feel something, hope, love, even a little fire, please don't forget to subscribe, like, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell me where you're watching from. I would genuinely love to say hello and know how far our story is traveling. Your voice in this community matters more than you know. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and comment where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you just to know how far our story is going. Some stories remind us that the quietest people often carry the loudest truths. Deborah didn't fight with power. She didn't fight with strategy or manipulation, or any of the tools that were used against her. She fought with something that took more courage than any of those things. She simply kept being herself. Keep showing up, keep caring, and working, and refusing to let the bitterness win. In the end, that was stronger than any crown. The palace changed, as places do when truth finally gets to settle in and make itself comfortable. The kitchens under Brenda remained exactly as efficient and intimidating as ever, except that now Brenda occasionally allowed herself to smile without immediately correcting it. Kristen became the head nursemaid officially, this time, and took her responsibilities with the particular seriousness of someone who has decided that their work matters and they are going to prove it. Donald grew into the kind of child who caused incidents and apologized for them with such complete sincerity that it was very difficult to stay properly firm about consequences. William grew into the kind who watched everything, said very little, and then said, at the exact right moment, the exact right thing. They were, by all accounts, very much loved. And Deborah, who had once been invisible in the corridors of Ashford Palace, who had eaten last and been laughed at and carried more than anyone ever counted, stood at the window of the nursery one quiet morning, listening to her sons sleeping, feeling the whole improbable weight of her life, and thought, I was always here. It just took them a while to look.